January 18, 1940. The winter air bites at the ancient stone walls of Grafeneck Castle in the Swabian Alb, a remote location hidden by dense German forests. Inside the facility's administrative office, Dr. Horst Schumann stands by a window, watching a convoy of 3 opaque, grey buses rumble through the heavy iron gates. The engines whine against the cold as they carry their cargo of 25 disabled men transferred from a nearby asylum in Eglfing-Haar. These passengers believe they are being moved to a better facility for improved medical care. But Schumann knows the truth. He checks the clipboard in his hand, ensuring the carbon monoxide canisters in the shed, disguised as a shower room, are fully pressurized. Today marks the beginning of a new era in medicine, where the physician's hand no longer heals the sick but surgically removes them from the body of the nation. To understand how a doctor like Schumann could stand at that window with such cold calculation, you must look back to the ideological infection that had been spreading through German medicine for decades. Long before the first shot of the war was fired, the medical community in Germany had embraced the concept of Volkskörper, or the body of the people. This nationalistic view shifted the physician's loyalty from the individual patient to the biological purity of the state. Leading academics argued that the state was a living organism and that the disabled, the mentally ill, and the hereditary weak were pathogens attacking its health. They were termed life unworthy of life, a burden that drained resources and corrupted the genetic future of the Aryan race. This theoretical cruelty transformed into state policy in the autumn of 1939. Under the cover of the invasion of Poland, Adolf Hitler signed a secret authorization on his personal stationery, backdating it to September, first to frame it as a wartime necessity. He charged Dr. Karl Brandt, his personal physician, and Philipp Bühler, the chief of the Chancellery, with the responsibility of expanding the authority of physicians. The decree was not a law passed by the Reichstag, but a private order that empowered specific doctors to grant a mercy death to patients considered incurable, according to the best available human judgment. This piece of paper was the death warrant for thousands, and the birth certificate of the Action T4 program. The bureaucratic machinery of death began not with guns, but with questionnaires distributed to hospitals and asylums across the Reich. The forms appeared mundane, asking for details about a patient's capacity to work, the length of their institutionalization, and their racial background. The directors of these institutions, often unaware of the true purpose, filled them out and returned them to a central office at Tiergartenstrasse, 4 inches Berlin, the address that gave the program its code name, there. A team of medical experts who had never seen or examined the patients reviewed the forms. They worked quickly, marking a red plus sign for death or a blue minus sign for life, based solely on cold written data. Once the lists were compiled, the community of patient transport, known grimly as the Gekrat, dispatched the infamous grey buses to collect the condemned. The windows were painted over to prevent the passengers from looking out and the public from looking in. Inside the buses, the atmosphere was a mix of confusion and sedated calm, as nurses often administered medication to keep the patients docile during the journey. They were driven to one of 6 specialized killing centers established across Greater Germany, including Hadamar, Hartheim, and Grafeneck. The families of the victims were told their loved ones were being transferred for special therapy or war-related relocation, a lie designed to buy time before the inevitable death notice arrived. Upon arrival at a center like Hadamar, the deception continued with terrifying efficiency to prevent panic and resistance among the new arrivals. The patients were told they needed to be disinfected before entering the ward, a standard procedure in institutional life that raised no immediate alarm. They were led into changing rooms, stripped of their clothing, and examined briefly by a physician. This was not a checkup to save their lives, but a final verification of their identity to ensure the correct person was about to be murdered. The doctor would also note a false cause of death, such as heart failure or pneumonia, to be entered later on the death certificate sent to the grieving family. The naked men and women were then heralded into a tiled room labeled as a shower facility, complete with shower heads protruding from the ceiling. Once the heavy steel doors were sealed shut, the role of the doctor shifted from observer to executioner in the most literal sense. It was a strict rule of the T4 program that a physician, not a soldier or a technician, must operate the gas valve. The logic was that this was a medical procedure, a deliverance administered by science. Dr. Schumann or his colleagues would turn the wheel, releasing pure carbon monoxide gas from cylinders into the sealed chamber, watching through a small observation port as the victims realized too late that no water would flow. The gas took nearly 20 minutes to complete its work, leaving the victims slumped against the tiled walls in a tangled mass of limbs. Once the ventilation fans had cleared the poisonous air, distinct teams of workers, known as burners, entered the room to disentangle the bodies. Before the corpses were dragged to the on-site crematoriums, a final act of looting occurred. The workers, often monitored by the medical staff, used pliers to break gold teeth from the mouths of the dead. These precious metals were collected and sent to the chaotic offices in Berlin to help finance the operation, reducing the human being to a pile of raw materials for the Reich's economy. While the adult euthanasia program utilized gas chambers, a parallel and equally horrific campaign targeted the youngest and most vulnerable members of society. The child euthanasia program encouraged midwives and doctors to report infants born with deformities like Down syndrome, microcephaly, or missing limbs. These children were sent to special pediatric wards, such as the one at Am Spiegelgrund in Vienna. Here, there were no gas chambers. Instead, doctors like Heinrich Gross killed the children slowly through starvation or overdoses of luminol, a powerful sedative. The children would drift into a coma and succumb to pneumonia, a method that appeared natural on medical charts and hid the murder in plain sight. The sheer scale of the operation made it impossible to keep secret. Despite the threats of the Gestapo and the secrecy of the SS, the smoke from the crematorium chimneys at centres like Hadamar hung low over the nearby towns, carrying the distinct and nauseating stench of burning flesh. Children in the local villages would taunt each other, pointing at the grey buses and saying, "You're crazy. They'll take you to the baking oven." The ash from human remains fell like grey snow on the gardens of local residents, forcing the reality of the atrocities into the daily lives of ordinary Germans. The veil of medical secrecy had been pierced by the industrial byproduct of mass murder. Resistance began to mount, not from the political left which had been crushed, but from the religious institutions that still held sway over the German conscience. In August 1941, the Lion of Münster, Bishop Clemens August von Galen, delivered a thunderous sermon that shook the Nazi hierarchy. He publicly condemned the killing of the unproductive, warning that if the state could kill the infirm, then no citizen was safe from execution once they became old or injured. His words were printed on leaflets and dropped by Allied pilots, causing a firestorm of public unrest that Hitler could not ignore during a critical phase of the war. Fearing a loss of domestic morale, Hitler issued a verbal order in late August 1941 to halt the adult euthanasia program officially. The gas chambers at the 6 main centers were dismantled or deactivated, and the personnel were reassigned. However, the halt was merely a strategic pause and a shift in methodology rather than an end to the killing. The murder of patients continued in a decentralized manner known as wild euthanasia. Doctors and nurses in hospitals across Germany continued to kill the unwanted through lethal injection and deliberate neglect, freed from the centralized oversight of Berlin but driven by the same murderous ideology. The legacy of Action T4 was not just the death of nearly 300,000 disabled people, but the creation of a blueprint for the annihilation of millions. The technology of the gas chamber, the psychological tricks used to calm victims, and the bureaucratic methods of processing mass death had been perfected. More importantly, a cadre of medical professionals and SS officers had been desensitized to the act of killing. Men like Christian Wirth and Franz Stangl, who had learned their trade in the asylums of Germany, were now looking for new work. They found their next assignment in the occupied East, where the final solution was waiting for their expertise. October 1941. The vast, pine-covered plains of occupied Poland are shrouded in an autumn mist that chills the bones of the laborers constructing a secret facility near the village of Belzec. Standing amidst the mud and felling trees is SS Obersturmführer Christian Wirth, a man whose brutal efficiency in the T4 program earned him the nickname Christian the Terrible. He has been transferred from the sanitized killing centers of Germany to the Wild East with a specific mission from the Reich Chancellery. His task is to scale up the euthanasia protocols from a medical procedure into an industrial process capable of eliminating entire populations. The expertise he carries in his mind, the blueprints of gas chambers and the psychology of deception, is the seed from which the Holocaust will grow. The Nazi leadership faced a grim logistical problem that required a radical medical solution. The mobile killing squads, or Einsatzgruppen, had been shooting Jewish men, women, and children into open pits across the Soviet Union. But the method was proving unsustainable. It was slow, public, and took a severe psychological toll on the executioners, who were turning to alcohol and suffering from nervous breakdowns. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS, demanded a method that was antiseptic and detached, one that would spare the killers the trauma of looking their victims in the eye. The T4 doctors had proven that gas was the answer, turning the act of murder into a depersonalized, technical operation. In the remote forests of the general government, Wirth and his cadre of former T4 personnel established the Operation Reinhard camps Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Unlike the concentration camps of the pre-war era, which were designed for detention and punishment, these new sites had no barracks for housing prisoners long-term. They were strictly factories of death, designed with a linear workflow similar to a slaughterhouse. The victims would arrive by train, be processed through a tube disguised with flowers and reassuring signs, and end their journey in the gas chambers. The doctors and technicians involved ceased to be medical professionals and became engineers of extermination. The technology of death required adaptation for the rugged conditions of the East. The bottled carbon monoxide used in the German asylums was too difficult to transport in the quantities needed for the millions of Jews arriving from the ghettos. Wirth improvised a cruder, yet equally lethal solution. By utilizing the internal combustion engine, he installed large tank or truck engines outside the gas chambers, piping the exhaust fumes directly into the sealed rooms. It was a horrific innovation that combined German engineering with the biological destruction of the enemy, creating a self-sustaining machine that required only fuel and victims to operate. As the machinery of the Holocaust was perfected, the epicenter of medicalized murder shifted to the sprawling complex of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Here, the process was refined further with the introduction of Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide that killed faster than carbon monoxide. It was at Auschwitz that the role of the SS doctor became most visible and most terrifying. The selection ramp became the ultimate stage where the physician's power was absolute. Trains arrived day and night, disgorging thousands of confused, exhausted people onto a concrete platform illuminated by blinding floodlights and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. The chaos on the ramp was a carefully orchestrated assault on the senses designed to stun the victims into submission. SS guards shouted conflicting orders. Attack dogs barked viciously, and the screams of separated families filled the air. Amidst this hellscape, the SS doctor stood as an island of calm authority, dressed in an immaculate field-grey uniform, often with white gloves and a riding crop. He represented the only semblance of order. He did not yell or strike the prisoners. He simply waited for them to be driven before him. This visual contrast was deliberate, reinforcing the idea that what was happening was a sanitary, administrative procedure rather than a massacre. The selection process itself was a mockery of a medical examination, conducted in a matter of seconds. The doctor would glance at the prisoner, assessing their age, physical condition, and apparent strength. There were no stethoscopes, no questions about medical history, and no compassion. With a flick of the thumb or a wave of the riding crop, the verdict was delivered links left or rects right. To the right meant a temporary reprieve through slave labor. To the left meant immediate death in the gas chambers. In that fleeting moment, the doctor decided the fate of a human being based solely on their economic utility to the Reich. This instantaneous triage condemned the vast majority of arrivals directly to their deaths. The elderly, the infirm, young children, and pregnant women were automatically sent to the left. Mothers who refused to be separated from their babies were sent to the gas chamber together, a decision the doctors justified as maintaining order. The logic was brutally functional. Those who could not work were considered ballast to be discarded. The doctors viewed the trainloads of people not as patients but as a biological mass that needed to be filtered, retaining the healthy cells for the war effort and excising the rest. To maintain the charade of medical care until the very end, the SS utilized a vehicle marked with the Red Cross emblem. This ambulance, which followed the column of doomed prisoners to the crematoria, did not carry medicine or first aid equipment. Instead, it carried the canisters of Zyklon B crystals and the SS disinfectors trained to handle them. The sight of the Red Cross symbol reassured the victims, lulling them into a false sense of security that they were being taken to a delousing station or a hospital. It was the ultimate perversion of international humanitarian symbols, used to cloak the machinery of genocide. The SS doctors did not physically pour the poison into the vents of the gas chambers. That task was left to the non-medical SS orderlies to maintain a sliver of psychological distance. However, the doctor's presence was legally and bureaucratically required for the gassing to proceed. They monitored the execution through peepholes in the gas chamber doors, ensuring the chemicals were effective and declaring the victims dead. This medical supervision was a crucial element of the Nazi system, lending a veneer of legality and scientific rigor to the act of mass murder. They signed the logs, certifying that the operation had been conducted according to protocol. The psychological detachment required to perform these duties was cultivated through intense ideological conditioning. These men viewed themselves as biological soldiers, fighting a war against a genetic infection that threatened the Aryan race. They convinced themselves that they were not killing human beings, but removing a pestilence. This twisted worldview allowed men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath to return to their quarters after a shift on the ramp and write affectionate letters to their wives and children. They compartmentalized their lives, separating the loving father from the cold-blooded selector on the platform. Coping with the reality of their actions often required chemical assistance. Alcohol flowed freely in the SS officers' mess at Auschwitz, where doctors and commanders would drink heavily to numb their senses after a night on the ramp. They held social gatherings, listened to classical music, and discussed philosophy, creating a surreal bubble of civilization in the middle of a death camp. This camaraderie reinforced their shared guilt and bound them together in a pact of silence. To break rank or show weakness was to betray the unit, so they drank and laughed while the chimneys burned in the distance. Among these doctors was Eduard Wirths, the chief SS doctor at Auschwitz, who bore the responsibility for the medical section's integrity. While he attempted to curb the arbitrary cruelty of individual guards and improve sanitation to prevent typhus outbreaks among the guards, his primary goal was to keep the killing machine running efficiently. He organized the duty rosters for the ramp, ensuring that every doctor, regardless of their specialization or reluctance, took their turn at the selection. By spreading the blood guilt among the entire medical staff, he ensured that no one could claim innocence or moral superiority. The corruption of the medical profession in the camps was total. These physicians had successfully inverted the core tenet of medicine primum non nocere, first, do no harm. In the Nazi worldview, the patient was the German nation, and the individual was merely a cell that could be sacrificed for the greater good. By framing genocide as a public health measure, they absolved themselves of criminal intent. They were not murderers in their own eyes. They were sanitation workers cleaning up the ghettos of Europe. This delusion protected their sanity while they committed the worst crimes in human history. As the trains continued to roll into Auschwitz, the selection ramp became the gateway to a new circle of hell. For those few who survived the initial wave of the doctor's thumb, the horror was far from over. They had been spared the gas chamber, only to become raw material for the next phase of the Nazi medical vision. The bodies that were deemed fit were now available for unrestricted use, paving the way for the sadistic curiosity of men who saw the concentration camp not just as a graveyard, but as a vast, unregulated laboratory. May 29, 1944, the sun beats down on the wooden ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau as a transport from Hungary disgorges its human cargo. The air is thick with the dust of thousands of shuffling feet and the acrid smoke of the crematoria, yet one man stands immaculate amidst the filth. SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Mengele, barely 33 years old, strolls through the chaos with the casual air of a man walking through a park. He wears his field grey uniform with tailored precision, white gloves on his hands, and a slight gap between his front teeth, visible as he whistles an operatic aria from Wagner. While other doctors view the selection duty as a grim necessity, Mengele seems to be in his element, his eyes scanning the terrified crowd not for threats, but for specimens. He is not looking for the strong to build the Reich, nor the weak to be discarded immediately. He is hunting for anomalies that can unlock the secrets of genetics. Suddenly, his gaze sharpens, and he raises a gloved hand to halt the flow of prisoners. He has spotted a pair of identical twin girls clinging to their mother's coat. His demeanor shifts instantly from detachment to charming interest as he approaches the family, with a polite smile that masks his lethal intent. He asks the mother if the children are twins. When she nods, hoping this distinction will save them, Mengele signals to the guards. The mother is sent to the left, to the gas chamber, while the children are pulled to the right, into the personal collection of the Angel of Death. Joseph Mengele was not a sadist who stumbled into medicine. He was a brilliant academic product of the German university system, holding a PhD in anthropology and a medical degree. He was a disciple of Professor Ottmar von Verschuer, a leading eugenicist who headed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human, Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin. Their shared scientific goal was to prove the supremacy of heredity over environment, thereby validating the Nazi racial theory that blood determined destiny. To do this scientifically, they needed to compare identical twins, who shared the same DNA, against the variables of disease and environment. In a normal world, finding enough twin sets for such a study would take decades. In Auschwitz, the trains delivered them by the dozen. The twins selected by Mengele were separated from the general camp population and housed in specific barracks, often in the gypsy camp, which the children referred to as the zoo. Unlike the starving prisoners in the main camp, these guinea pigs were allowed to keep their own clothes and their hair. They were given extra rations and spared from hard labor and the random beatings of the guards. This relative luxury was a calculated tactic, not an act of kindness. Mengele needed his specimens to be healthy so that the results of his experiments would not be compromised by starvation or exhaustion. He was preserving the biology of the subjects while completely disregarding their humanity. To the children, Mengele presented a terrifying duality that warped their understanding of safety and danger. He introduced himself as Uncle Pepe, bringing pockets full of candy and chocolates which he distributed with a pat on the head. He would drive them around the camp in his car and speak to them with a soft, engaging voice. This psychological manipulation was absolute. The children learned to trust the very man who held the power to dissect them. He created a bond of dependency, ensuring that his subjects remained docile and cooperative. Yet, if a child cried too much or refused an order, the mask would slip, revealing a cold fury that could lead to instant execution on the spot. The daily routine for the twins involved hours of obsessive, non-invasive measurement that masqueraded as legitimate anthropology. Mengele and his assistants would have the children stand naked for hours while they used cold steel calipers to measure every millimeter of their bodies. They recorded the width of the nose, the distance between the eyes, the circumference of the head, and the length of the limbs. Thousands of data points were meticulously logged in ledgers, creating a veneer of scientific rigor. This was the science of the Third Reich, a mountain of data built on the foundation of absolute power, collecting endless statistics to prove a racial hierarchy that existed only in their minds. However, the measurements were merely the prelude to the invasive nightmares that followed in the surgical blocks. Without any concern for pain management or sterile technique, Mengele ordered massive blood draws from the children, often taking so much that the smaller victims would faint or go into shock. He needed to see if the blood of one twin was chemically identical to the other. When this wasn't enough, he ordered cross-transfusions, pumping the blood of one twin into the other to observe the reaction. The children would writhe in fever and agony as their bodies rejected the foreign blood, while Mengele observed the tremors with clinical detachment. Noting the reactions in his notebook, his obsession with the Aryan ideal led him to conduct horrific experiments on the eyes of his victims. He was fascinated by heterochromia, a condition where eyes are different colors, and sought to artificially engineer blue eyes. The hallmark of the master race, he ordered drops of adrenaline, dye, and other chemicals to be injected directly into the irises of living children. The procedure was excruciatingly painful, causing severe infections, temporary or permanent blindness, and agonizing swelling. When the experiment failed to produce the desired permanent color change, as it always did, Mengele would often have the child killed so he could extract the eyes and pin them to a board for his collection. The depravity of his curiosity knew no bounds, leading to surgical atrocities that defied all medical logic. In one infamous instance, Mengele attempted to create artificial Siamese twins by sewing two Romani children together. He connected their veins and organs in a crude surgical procedure, hoping to observe how they would function as a single organism. The children screamed in agony for days as their wounds festered and gangrene set in. The experiment was a failure, resulting only in prolonged suffering and death. It was surgery as a form of torture, driven by a chaotic imagination that had been freed from all moral restraints. To assist in his grisly work, Mengele conscripted prisoner doctors, most notably Dr. Place. Miklos Niesli, a Jewish pathologist. Niesli was forced to perform the autopsies on the twins that Mengele had finished studying. The tragedy of the twin research was that for the data to be valuable to Mengele, the twins had to die at the same time. If one twin died of disease or during an experiment, the other was immediately murdered with a chloroform injection to the heart. This allowed for a simultaneous comparative autopsy, where the organs could be examined side by side. The healthy twin was reduced to nothing more than a control sample, their life extinguished solely to calibrate the data of their siblings' death. Mengele's ambition extended beyond the camp. He viewed Auschwitz as a field station for the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. He regularly packaged and shipped crates of specimens' eyes, organs, and skeletons back to his mentor, Professor von Verschuer. These packages were marked as war material, urgent, and traveled through the German postal system. The scientific elite in Berlin received these human parts, knowing fully well their origin, and used them to further their academic papers. The corruption was not limited to the barbed wire of the camp. It permeated the highest levels of German academia, which eagerly consumed the fruits of mass murder, despite the horrors. A unique bond formed among the Mengele twins who managed to survive the selection and the laboratory. They developed a fierce loyalty to one another, often sharing food and protecting their siblings during the terrifying nights in the barracks. They understood that their status as Mengele's children was the only thing keeping them from the gas chambers. A precarious existence on the razor's edge. Survivors like Eva Moses Kaur would later recount that their sole drive was to ensure their twin did not die, for they knew that the death of one meant the immediate execution of the other. They were bound together by blood and the threat of imminent annihilation. As the Red Army approached in January 1945, the order and omnipotence of the camp began to crumble. Mengele, ever the pragmatist, did not stay to defend his work or his patients. He packed his most valuable research notes and the data he had harvested from thousands of murdered children into boxes. He fled Auschwitz days before the liberation, slipping away into the chaos of a collapsing Germany. He left behind the dead and the dying, but he took the science he believed would secure his future professorship. He vanished like a ghost, leaving a legacy of trauma that would haunt the world, while other doctors in other camps continued their own gruesome work until the bitter end. February 22, 1942. The dawn breaks grey and bitter cold over the Dachau concentration camp, located just a few miles northwest of Munich. In the secluded courtyard of Block 5, a large wooden basin filled with water sits ominously, chunks of ice floating on its surface like jagged green glass. Standing beside the tank, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, is Dr. Sigmund Rasche, a man whose mediocrity as a scientist is eclipsed only by his limitless ambition. He checks his stopwatch and nods to the SS guards, who drag a struggling prisoner toward the water. The man, a Soviet prisoner of war, screams as he is forced into the freezing vat. For Rasche, the scream is irrelevant noise. The only thing that matters is the temperature reading on the chart that will soon be on Heinrich Himmler's desk. While Mengele's crimes in Auschwitz were driven by a twisted obsession with race and genetics, the atrocities committed at Dachau were born of military desperation. The German Luftwaffe was facing a crisis in the skies over the English Channel and the freezing expanse of the North Sea. Pilots who bailed out of their damaged aircraft were dying of hypothermia within minutes in the icy waters, or suffering fatal decompression sickness when ejecting at high altitudes. The German Air Force needed data to design better survival suits and equipment, but animal testing could not provide the specific physiological answers they required. They needed human subjects, and the concentration camp system provided an endless, disposable supply of biological material for the war effort. Dr. Sigmund Rasche was the architect of this nightmare, a man who had maneuvered his way into the inner circle of the SS, not through brilliance, but through sycophancy. He was not a high-ranking academic like the professors in Berlin, but he possessed a dangerous connection. His wife was a former lover of Heinrich Himmler. Rasche exploited this relationship to bypass the standard medical hierarchy, proposing to the Reichsführer SS that the human material at Dachau be used for terminal experiments. Himmler, fascinated by the pseudoscience and eager to support the military, gave his enthusiastic approval. This authorization transformed Block 5 into a torture chamber where the boundaries of human endurance were mapped out in blood and ice. The first phase of the experiments focused on high-altitude survival. The Luftwaffe had supplied Rasche with a mobile decompression chamber, a claustrophobic steel cylinder mounted on a trailer that looked innocuously like a utility vehicle. Prisoners were locked inside this airtight capsule, and powerful pumps sucked the oxygen out to simulate the atmospheric conditions of falling from a plane at 68,000 feet. The rapid change in pressure caused nitrogen bubbles to form in the blood, a condition known as the bends, but magnified to a lethal degree. Inside the chamber, the prisoners would writhe in agony, tearing at their heads as their eardrums burst and their lungs collapsed under the vacuum. Rasche observed these tortures through a thick glass porthole, taking meticulous notes on the subjects' reactions as they gasped for air that wasn't there. Some men died instantly from an embolism, while others descended into madness, banging their heads against the steel walls until they fell unconscious. In his quest for thoroughness, Rasche did not stop at observation. He performed vivisections on the dying victims, slicing open their skulls and chests while their hearts were still beating underwater. He wanted to see the air bubbles moving through the blood vessels of the brain in real time. This was not research, it was sadistic curiosity masquerading as physiology, resulting in the torture and death of up to 200 men in the pressure chamber alone. By the summer of 1942, the focus shifted to the freezing experiments, driven by the urgent need to understand how long a downed pilot could survive in winter waters. The wooden basin in the courtyard became the center of operations. Rasche tested various scenarios to simulate battlefield conditions. Some prisoners were forced into the tank naked, while others wore standard Luftwaffe flight suits to test the insulation properties of the fabric. The water temperature was lowered to near freezing, between 36 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The subjects were kept in the water for hours, their bodies shaking violently as the cold penetrated their core, slowly shutting down their organs one by one. The suffering inflicted during these sessions was prolonged and documented with chilling bureaucratic precision. A rectal thermometer was inserted into each victim and wired to a chart recorder in the observation room, creating a graph of the dying man's declining body temperature. As the core temperature dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the prisoners would lose consciousness, their heart rate slowing to a crawl. Yet, Rasche often kept them in the water even after they passed out, pushing the limits to see exactly when the heart would stop completely. For those who did not die in the tank, the horror continued with the testing of rewarming methods, which proved to be just as lethal as the freezing itself. The debate among German military doctors was whether a frozen man should be warmed up slowly or rapidly. To settle this, Rasche treated the survivors of the ice tank like frozen meat. Some were thrown into boiling water baths, a shock to the system that often caused immediate cardiac arrest. Others were placed under intense sun lamps or packed with internal heating devices that burned their esophagus and stomach. The rapid rewarming method using hot baths actually proved the most effective for survival, a finding that is still cited in emergency medicine today. However, this discovery cost the lives of dozens of men who were literally boiled to death or died from the thermal shock of the crude experiments. In a twist of perversion that appealed to Himmler's obsession with Nordic mythology and primal instincts, Rasche also conducted animal heat experiments, He suggested that the body heat of women might be more effective at reviving a frozen man than mechanical means. Prisoners who had been frozen to the brink of death were placed in a bed between two naked women from the Ravensbrück concentration camp, who were forced to participate. Himmler and Rasche voyeuristically observed these sessions, hoping to prove a connection between sexual arousal and rewarming. The results were medically useless, serving only to indulge the depraved fantasies of the SS leadership under the guise of scientific inquiry. The victims of these experiments were primarily Soviet prisoners of war and German political prisoners, men who were viewed by the Nazis as enemies of the state and therefore expendable. Among them were priests and intellectuals, men who bore their suffering with a quiet dignity that infuriated their tormentors. Rasche noted with frustration that the racial resistance of the Russians seemed higher than that of other groups, a racist interpretation of the simple fact that some men were physically tougher than others. To the doctor, they were not human beings but data points. If a subject died too quickly and ruined the dataset, Rasche would simply order the guards to fetch another unit from the barracks. Himmler's involvement in the Dachau experiments was constant and micromanaged. He exchanged frequent letters with Rasche, offering suggestions and demanding progress reports. When Rasche complained that the hearts of the subjects stopped too soon to allow for complete observation, Himmler encouraged him to continue, shielding him from any criticism within the medical corps. This patronage emboldened Rasche to expand his work into dry, cold experiments, where prisoners were chained outdoors, naked in the freezing Bavarian winter night. Every hour, assistants would pour buckets of water over them to simulate the freezing spray of the ocean, leaving them to freeze into statues of ice by morning. Despite the absolute power he wielded, Rasche's scientific methodology was chaotic and fraudulent. He was desperate to produce results that would secure a prestigious professorship after the war. As the pressure mounted, he began to falsify his charts, smoothing out the data curves to make them look more consistent and scientific. He selectively discarded results that didn't fit his hypothesis and claimed successes that never happened. The Dachau data was a mix of real, torture-induced physiological observations and pure fabrication, a testament to the corruption that occurs when ideology and ambition supersede ethics and peer review. The end for Sigmund Rasche came not from the Allied courts, but from the very system he served. His ambition led him to commit a fraud that even the SS could not overlook. Desperate to please Himmler, who encouraged SS officers to have large families, Rasche and his wife had claimed to have given birth to 3 children in rapid succession. In reality, his wife was infertile, and they had kidnapped or bought babies to present as their own. When the deception was uncovered in 1944, Himmler felt personally betrayed. The couple was arrested, and Rasche was imprisoned in the very camp where he had tortured so many. Days before Dachau was liberated, on Himmler's direct orders, Rasche was executed by a pistol shot to the head in a cell, silenced by his own masters. The legacy of the Dachau experiments presents a profound ethical dilemma that persists in modern medicine. After the war, the Allies seized Rasche's notes, known as the Dachau hypothermia data. For decades, researchers debated whether it was ethical to cite this data to design survival suits for fishermen and mountaineers. Some argued that the data was the only information available on human cooling and could save lives, redeeming the suffering of the victims. Others argued that the data was scientifically flawed due to Rasche's incompetence and that using it gave a posthumous validation to torture. The scientific community largely decided that the fruit of the poisonous tree must not be eaten. To use the data is to become complicit in the crime. As the smoke cleared over Dachau and the extent of the Luftwaffe experiments was revealed, it became clear that the corruption of medicine was not limited to men. While Rasche was freezing men in Bavaria, a different kind of horror was unfolding to the north. In the swamps of Mecklenburg, at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, a group of female prisoners was being prepared for a new series of surgical nightmares. These women, young and healthy, were about to be sacrificed not for the air war, but to test the treatments for the battlefield wounds of the German army, in a chapter that would become known as the story of the rabbits. July 24, 1942. The summer heat presses down on the marshes of Mecklenburg, north of Berlin, turning the air inside the barracks of Ravensbrück concentration camp into a suffocating blanket. In the dusty square of the camp, A group of 74 young Polish women stands in formation, their hearts pounding against their ribs. They are not Jewish. Nor are they criminals. They are political prisoners. Members of the Polish resistance, Girl Guides, and university students, representing the future intelligentsia of their destroyed nation. An SS guard reads from a clipboard, calling out names with a harsh, barking cadence. As each woman steps forward, she is not marched to a work detail or a punishment cell, but to the camp infirmary, known as the Revier. They do not know it yet, but they have been selected to become the unwilling subjects of a medical atrocity that will earn them the grim nickname the Rabbits. The catalyst for their torture did not originate in the camp, but in the highest echelons of the Nazi hierarchy in Prague. 2 months earlier, Reinhard Heydrich, the brutal protector of Bohemia and Moravia and the architect of the final solution, had been assassinated by Czech commandos. He survived the initial grenade explosion but died days later from sepsis and gas gangrene caused by debris from the car upholstery lodging in his spleen. His death sent shockwaves through the Reich, particularly infuriating Adolf Hitler, who demanded to know why his top lieutenant had not been saved. The finger of blame pointed directly at Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's childhood friend and personal physician, who had refused to treat Heydrich with the new miracle drug, sulfonamide, preferring traditional surgery. Gebhardt, a man of immense ego and the president of the German Red Cross, found his reputation in tatters. Hitler publicly humiliated him, suggesting that his surgical arrogance had cost the Reich one of its most valuable leaders. Desperate to regain the Führer's favor and prove his medical hypothesis correct, Gebhardt proposed a series of experiments. He intended to prove that sulfonamides were ineffective against massive traumatic wounds involving gas gangrene. However, to prove this scientifically, he could not rely on laboratory rats, whose physiology differed too much from humans. He needed living subjects with healthy immune systems to simulate the wounds of a German soldier on the Russian front. He turned to Himmler, who granted him access to the human material at Ravensbrück. The surgical team assembled for this task included Dr. Fritz Fischer and, most notably, Dr. Herta Oberheiser. Oberheiser was a rarity in the Nazi medical world, a female physician in a regime that generally believed women belonged in the kitchen and the nursery. Ambitious and ideologically fanatical, she sought to prove that she could be just as tough and unsentimental as her male counterparts. She viewed the Polish women not as patients, but as enemies of the state whose bodies were fair game for the advancement of German military medicine. Her presence in the operating room added a layer of psychological horror, as the victims often expected a woman to possess a shred of maternal mercy, only to find a coldness that rivaled the SS guards. The experiments began with a brutality that stunned even the hardened camp staff. The women were dragged into the operating theatre and anesthetized, though often with insufficient doses that left them drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctors then proceeded to inflict battlefield wounds on their lower legs. They made deep, jagged incisions into the muscle of the calf or thigh, deliberately avoiding clean surgical cuts to mimic the tearing effect of shrapnel. But the wound was only the beginning. To simulate the dirty conditions of the front lines, the doctors forced foreign objects into the open flesh. They stuffed the incisions with wood shavings, rusty nails, glass splinters, and dirt, turning the leg into a festering pit of potential infection. To ensure that gangrene would set in, the doctors introduced specific cultures of bacteria directly into the wounds. They used highly virulent strains of Staphylococcus, Clostridium perfringens, the agent of gas gangrene, and tetanus, often cultured from the dust and decay of the camp itself. Once the cocktail of filth and bacteria was packed inside, the wounds were sewn shut, trapping the infection deep within the muscle. The circulation was often constricted by tying off blood vessels to simulate the crush injuries of a bombing, creating the perfect anaerobic environment for gangrene to thrive. The women woke up in the recovery room screaming, their legs swelling to the size of logs, turning black and green as the necrosis set in. The experiment was designed as a comparative study, which meant the treatment of the victims was arbitrarily divided. One group received high doses of sulfonamide drugs, while another group received nothing, serving as the control to observe the natural, fatal progression of the infection. A third group was treated with traditional surgery, involving the reopening and draining of the wounds. Gebhardt and Oberheiser visited the ward daily, not to offer relief, but to observe the rot. They ignored the agony of the women, whose fevers spiked to dangerous levels, recording the spread of the infection with clinical detachment. When the sulfonamides failed to stop the massive gangrene exactly as Gebhardt had hoped, he felt vindicated. He had tortured dozens of women to prove a point to Hitler that he had been right to let Heydrich die. However, the cruelty did not stop with infection experiments. Gebhardt, an orthopedic surgeon by trade, used the opportunity to conduct bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation experiments at his private clinic in nearby Hohenleichen and at the camp. Healthy women were taken to the operating table, where their legs were shattered with hammers to study fracture healing. In other cases, large sections of the fibula bone were surgically removed from a prisoner's leg to be transplanted into German soldiers who had lost bone in the war. The donors were left with permanent deformities, their legs unstable and useless, forced to hop or crawl back to the barracks where they were expected to work or die. The nerve experiments were perhaps the most excruciating. The doctors would slice open the leg to locate the sciatic or tibial nerves, cutting out segments to test regeneration or transplant techniques. This left the victims with paralyzed limbs, chronic pain, or a condition known as drop foot. Oberheiser was particularly involved in the post-operative care, which often consisted of active sadism. When women cried out for water due to the raging fevers of sepsis, she would refuse them. Or worse, mix vinegar with the water to induce vomiting. If a patient was deemed to be recovering too quickly, or if the wound wasn't festering enough, she would reopen the incision and rub in more glass and dirt to restart the infection. Despite the absolute power of the SS, a unique and fierce resistance movement formed around these victims. The other prisoners in Ravensbrück, witnessing the hopping, crippled gait of the survivors, christened them Kaninchen, or rabbits, a term that acknowledged their status as laboratory animals. But rather than shunning them, the camp population rallied to protect them. They shared their meager rations with the victims, stole bandages from the hospital, and helped them stand during the endless roll calls so they wouldn't be selected for the gas chamber due to their inability to work. The rabbits became a symbol of defiance. The SS had broken their bodies, but the collective spirit of the women refused to let them be discarded. The prisoners also fought back with the only weapon they had, the truth. Realizing that the Nazis would likely kill all the rabbits before the end of the war to destroy the evidence, the women began a secret documentation campaign. They used invisible ink, manufactured from urine or dissolved headache tablets, to write detailed letters between the lines of the censored camp mail. These letters contained the names of the victims, the dates of the surgeries, and the names of the doctors Gebhardt, Fischer, and Oberheiser. The messages were smuggled out to the Polish underground and eventually reached London and the International Red Cross. The world knew about the rabbits of Ravensbrück while the experiments were still happening. As the war turned against Germany in 1944 and the Red Army advanced, the SS leadership decided that the rabbits were a liability. Orders were issued to liquidate the survivors. However, the camp underground pulled off a miracle of logistics and courage. When the SS came with lists of names to collect the women for execution, the other prisoners created chaos. They cut the power to the barracks, switched identification numbers on the uniforms, and hid the rabbits in the attics and crawl spaces of the typhus wards, where the guards were afraid to enter. For months, the crippled women lived in the shadows, fed and sheltered by their fellow inmates, playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with the executioners. In the final days, as the camp was evacuated and the death marches began, many of the rabbits were too weak to walk. Their friends carried them, or pulled them on makeshift sleds through the snow, refusing to leave them behind to be shot. When the Soviet forces finally liberated Ravensbrück in April 1945, they found the survivors bearing the gruesome scars of the operating table. Their legs were mangled, missing bones and muscles, covered in deep, erratic scar tissue that looked like shark bites. These physical deformities were undeniable proof of the crimes committed by the medical elite of the Third Reich. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, delusional to the end, believed his work was justified by the necessities of war. He argued that if a soldier could be conscripted to die for the state, a prisoner could be conscripted to be operated on for the state. He fled the camp but was eventually captured. Herta Oberheiser also attempted to blend back into civilian life, working as a family doctor after the war, treating patients with the same hands that had tortured the women of Poland. But the evidence hidden by the resistance, the lists, the photos, and the survivors themselves would not let them escape. The rabbits had survived the laboratory, and they were ready to testify. The experiments at Ravensbrück represented a specific kind of medical violation, the direct infliction of trauma on healthy bodies to simulate war. But while Gebhardt and his team were hacking away at limbs to fix soldiers, another group of Nazi doctors was working on a project with a much grander and darker scope. They were not interested in healing wounds. They were interested in preventing life altogether. In the shadow of Auschwitz and other camps, a quiet, industrial effort was underway to sterilize millions of people efficiently, using X-rays and chemicals to ensure that the inferior races would have no future. July 7, 1942. In a sterile conference room in Berlin, Heinrich Himmler convenes a secret meeting with top medical officials to discuss the future of the conquered territories. The genocide in the gas chambers is proceeding with grim efficiency. But the Reichsführer SS is looking beyond the immediate massacres to the long-term management of the inferior races. The Nazi leadership envisions a vast empire built on slave labor, but they face a demographic paradox. They need millions of workers. Yet they cannot allow these subhumans to breed and pollute the Aryan bloodline. Himmler demands a medical solution that is fast, invisible, and irreversible. He wants a method to sterilize millions of people without their knowledge, ensuring that the current generation of slaves is the last. The man who steps forward to answer this call is Professor Karl Klauberg, a distinguished gynecologist and researcher who had once been respected internationally for his work on female fertility hormones. Now, his ambition has curdled into a dark obsession with negative eugenics. He proposes a chemical method of sterilization that would eliminate the need for time-consuming surgery. Himmler, impressed by Klauberg's confidence, grants him unlimited resources and a dedicated facility at Auschwitz. In Block 10 of the main camp, Klauberg establishes a research station that is essentially a prison within a prison. The windows are boarded up to hide the screams, and the test subjects are Jewish women, many of them married and terrified, dragged from the general population to serve as his guinea pigs. Klauberg's method involved the injection of a caustic chemical irritant directly into the uterus, designed to cause severe inflammation and scar tissue that would block the fallopian tubes. The substance was a murky, grey liquid, often a mixture of formalin, acid, and a contrast medium used for X-rays. The procedure was performed without anesthesia. As Klauberg considered painkillers a waste of resources on prisoners, the women were strapped into gynecological chairs, their legs spread, while Klauberg or his assistants forced the liquid into their bodies with high-pressure syringes. The pain was immediate and blinding, described by survivors as feeling like their insides were being torn apart by burning coals. The aftermath of the injection was a prolonged agony that often led to death. The caustic chemicals burned the delicate lining of the uterus and leaked into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis and massive infections. Women lay on the straw mattresses of Block 10, writhing in fever, their bellies swollen and hard as stone. For Klauberg, these complications were merely data points. To verify the success of the blockage, he would drag the women back to the examination room weeks later for X-rays, often forcing more liquid into their already ravaged organs. He boasted in letters to Himmler that he was close to perfecting a method where a single doctor with 10 assistants could sterilize up to 1,000 women in a single day. While Klauberg focused on chemistry, another doctor, Horst Schumann, approached the problem with the brute force of physics. Schumann, a veteran of the T4 euthanasia program who had operated the gas chamber at Grafeneck, set up his shop in the women's camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. His tool of choice was high-intensity X-radiation. He knew that radiation could destroy reproductive cells, but he needed to determine the precise dosage that would induce permanent sterility without killing the worker immediately. He constructed a special station equipped with 2 powerful Siemens X-ray machines, where the deception was maintained until the very moment the switch was thrown. Young Jewish men and women, often in their late teens or early 20s, were marched into a waiting room and told they were being processed for lice control or a medical checkup. They were ordered to strip and stand between two machines that hummed with a menacing electrical buzz. Schumann sat behind a lead-shielded wall. Looking through a small window, he would activate the machines for several minutes at a time, bombarding the victims' ovaries and testes with radiation levels hundreds of times higher than a standard medical X-ray. The prisoners felt a strange, deep heat penetrating their groins, unaware that their future was being burned away in the invisible storm of photons. The effects of the radiation were horrific and manifested within hours. The victims suffered from severe radiation burns, their skin turning red, then blistering and turning black as the tissue died. They vomited uncontrollably and suffered from agonizing diarrhea as the radiation poisoned their internal organs. But for Schumann, the experiment was not over. To scientifically prove that the sterilization had worked, he needed to examine the organs physically. He ordered the surgical removal of the ovaries and testes from the irradiated victims. These operations were performed firmly and crudely, often without proper anesthesia, leaving the patients mutilated, hormonally destroyed, and prone to fatal infections. Those who survived the radiation and the subsequent castration were often sent back to the labor gangs. However, their weakened state made them useless to the SS, and most were eventually selected for the gas chambers. Schumann's experiments proved to be a failure in terms of efficiency. The equipment was expensive, the electricity usage was high, and the patients were left too sick to work. Yet, the cruelty continued for months simply because the machinery was there and the ideology demanded it. It was a testament to the Nazis' willingness to burn through human lives in pursuit of a scientific mirage that promised total biological control, while sterilization aimed to stop life. Another group of SS doctors was engaged in a deadly game with the microscopic agents of death: typhus, malaria, and cholera. The German army on the Eastern Front was losing thousands of men to disease, and the pharmaceutical industry was desperate for vaccines. The concentration camps provided the perfect laboratory for testing experimental drugs that were too dangerous for German citizens. At Buchenwald concentration camp, in Block 46, the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS established a closed ward dedicated to the study of typhus, commanded by Dr. Erwin Ding-Schuler, to test the vaccines. Ding-Schuler needed a constant supply of the typhus virus. Since the virus cannot survive long outside a host, he used human beings as living petri dishes. This group of prisoners, known as the passage group, was injected with infected blood solely to keep the disease alive and virulent. As soon as one man fell terminally ill, his blood was drawn and injected into a healthy prisoner, ensuring an unbroken chain of suffering. These men were doomed to die from the fever, delirium, and organ failure that characterized typhus, their lives sacrificed merely to maintain a culture of the pathogen for the doctor's convenience. The vaccine trials themselves were conducted with a cold, mathematical cruelty. Ding-Schuler would select a group of prisoners and divide them into two categories, the test group and the control group. The test group received the experimental vaccine, which was often toxic or completely ineffective. The control group received a placebo, usually salt water. Then, every single man in both groups was deliberately infected with typhus. The doctors would then watch and wait. The control group was effectively sentenced to death to provide a baseline for the mortality rate. The doctors charted the fevers and the deaths, creating neat graphs that compared the survival rates, while the barrack filled with the stench of the dying. At Dachau, the focus was on malaria, led by Dr. Klaus Schilling, a retired professor who had spent his life studying tropical medicine. Despite his age, Schilling was zealous in his pursuit of a cure for the disease that plagued the German troops in Italy and North Africa. He was given a station at the camp where he kept cages of Anopheles mosquitoes, bred specifically to carry malaria. He forced prisoners to stick their arms into the cages, allowing hundreds of mosquitoes to feed on them until infection was guaranteed. For those who did not get sick from the bites, he injected the sporozoites directly into their veins. Once the prisoners were shivering with the violent chills of malaria, Schilling treated them with a variety of synthetic drugs, often at dosages that were lethal. He tested sulfonamides, pyramidon, and other experimental compounds supplied by major German pharmaceutical companies like IG Farben and Bayer. These corporations were fully aware of where their drugs were being tested. They viewed the concentration camps as a convenient extension of their own research and development departments. The prisoners were cheaper than laboratory rats and provided data that was directly applicable to humans. The profit motive of the pharmaceutical giants had seamlessly merged with the genocidal machinery of the SS. The tragedy of the pharmacists of the camps was the complete betrayal of the healer's role. These doctors were not killing in a moment of passion or under the direct threat of a gun. They were killing as part of a career trajectory. They wrote papers, gave lectures at medical conferences, and argued over patents, all based on the slow, agonizing deaths of thousands of innocent people. They believed that if they could solve the problem of typhus or malaria, they would be hailed as heroes of the Reich, their crimes washed away by the utility of their discoveries. They had convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, no matter how bloody the path. As the Allied armies closed in during the spring of 1945, the doctors of Block 10, Block 46, and the malaria stations began to panic. They knew that their research would be viewed differently by the liberators. They scrambled to destroy the files, the X-ray plates, and the tissue samples. Clauberg fled to Western Germany, hoping his pre-war reputation would save him. Schumann vanished into the chaos. But they left behind something they could not burn: the survivors, the women with the scarred wombs, the men with the radiation burns, and the hollow-eyed victims of the typhus block were waiting. The war was ending. But the reckoning was just beginning. The laboratories were closed, and the courtroom doors were about to open. December 9, 1946. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 600 inches, the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, swing open, revealing a scene that the world has never witnessed before. Inside the dock, where 23 defendants sit under the watchful guard of American military police, are not the rugged generals or the shouting demagogues of the Nazi Party. These men are distinguished, educated, and refined. They are the medical elite of the Third Reich. Surgeons, professors, and health administrators who stand accused of perverting the noble art of healing into a macabre science of death. The doctor's trial, officially known as United States of America, v. Karl Brandt, et al., is about to begin, tasked with dissecting the moral collapse of an entire profession. The prosecution, led by Brigadier General Telford Taylor, faces the daunting task of establishing legal culpability for crimes that have no precedent in human history. In his opening statement, Taylor does not mince words, describing the defendants as men who have prostituted a noble profession and accusing them of turning Germany into an infernal laboratory. The prosecution argues that these doctors did not merely follow orders. They were the proactive architects of the genocide. They designed the gas chambers, selected the victims, and monitored the dying with clipboards in hand. The trial is not just about punishing individuals, but about putting the ideology of state-sponsored biology on trial, exposing the lethal consequences of valuing a race over a human life. The evidence presented to the tribunal is a catalogue of horrors that stuns the judges and the press gallery. American prosecutors wheel in carts filled with the defendants' own meticulous records, logbooks of freezing experiments, jars containing human specimens, and letters boasting of sterilization quotas. The bureaucracy of the Holocaust becomes its own accuser. The defense lawyers attempt to argue that these experiments were necessary for the war effort, citing the state of emergency as a justification for suspending medical ethics. They claim that the victims were already condemned to death, and therefore, their use in scientific research was a pragmatic way to salvage some benefit for the German people. It is a defense built on the cold logic of utility, completely devoid of empathy. The most dramatic moments of the trial occur when the survivors take the stand to confront their tormentors. Among them are several of the rabbits from Ravensbrück, the Polish women whose legs had been mutilated by Dr. This, Karl Gebhardt and Dr. Race, Herta Oberheiser. As they limp across the courtroom floor to show their scars to the judges, the abstract horror of the medical files transforms into undeniable human suffering. Gebhardt, sitting in the dock, refuses to meet their eyes, maintaining an air of arrogant indifference. The testimony of these women dismantles the defense's claim that the subjects were volunteers or criminals, revealing them instead as innocent captives subjected to sadism disguised as surgery. On August 20, 1947. The tribunal delivers its verdict, rejecting the defense that obedience to superior orders excuses the commission of war crimes. 7 of the defendants, including Karl Brandt, the lead physician of the T4 program, and Karl Gebhardt, are sentenced to death by hanging. They are found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Others, like Herta Oberheiser, receive prison sentences, while 7 are acquitted due to a lack of direct evidence linking them to specific atrocities. The sentences are carried out at Landsberg prison, the very place where Adolf Hitler once wrote Mein Kampf. As the trapdoors opened, the Reich's medical hierarchy was physically dismantled, but the questions they raised would linger long after the executioner's work was done. From the ashes of this trial emerged a document that would fundamentally change the practice of medicine forever, the Nuremberg Code. The judges, realizing that no pre-existing law adequately covered human experimentation, drafted a set of 10 ethical principles. The first and most critical point states unequivocally that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This principle shattered the Nazi notion that the state owns the body of the citizen. The code established that science, no matter how potentially beneficial to society, cannot override the fundamental rights of the individual. It became the bedrock of modern bioethics, influencing every institutional review board and clinical trial in the free world today. However, justice at Nuremberg was incomplete. While the leaders hung, many of the most notorious criminals slipped through the cracks of a shattered Europe. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, was not in the dock at Nuremberg. He had fled Auschwitz in January 1945, disguised himself as a regular Wehrmacht soldier, and spent years hiding on a farm in Bavaria. In 1949, utilizing the Ratlines escape routes organized by sympathetic clergy and officials, he sailed to Argentina. For decades, Mengele lived in South America, constantly looking over his shoulder. Fearing capture by the Israeli Mossad, who had successfully kidnapped Adolf Eichmann, despite international manhunts, he died of a stroke while swimming in Brazil in 1979. Never facing a judge for his crimes against the twins, Mengele was not alone in his escape. Dr. Aribert Heim, known as Dr. Death for his lethal injections of gasoline into the hearts of prisoners at Mauthausen, evaded capture for his entire life, reportedly dying in hiding in Cairo, Egypt. In 1992, after converting to Islam to mask his identity, Dr. Horst Schumann, the sterilizer of Auschwitz, fled to Africa, working as a doctor in Sudan and Ghana before being extradited to Germany in the 1972, only to be deemed too old and sick to stand trial. The failure to bring these men to justice remains a bitter pill for the survivors, a reminder that the chaos of the post-war world often allowed evil to fade into obscurity rather than face retribution. There is also a darker chapter to the aftermath, one that implicates the victors. As the Cold War began to freeze relations between the East and West, the moral clarity of Nuremberg gave way to strategic pragmatism. Under Operation Paperclip, the United States intelligence agencies actively recruited Nazi scientists to work on American military and space projects. This included doctors involved in aviation medicine. The very data gathered by Dr. Rascher at Dachau regarding high-altitude physiology and hypothermia was quietly absorbed by the U.S. Air Force. Men who had been complicit in the Nazi system were given new identities and careers in the U.S., their pasts scrubbed clean in exchange for their knowledge against the Soviets. It was a Faustian bargain that prioritized technological advantage over absolute justice. Inside Germany, the medical profession struggled to confront its own complicity. For decades after the war, a code of silence prevailed. Many doctors who had participated in the sterilization programs or the euthanasia selection boards returned to their civilian practices, treating patients as if nothing had happened. The German Medical Association took years to fully acknowledge the extent of the betrayal. It was not until the student movements of the 1962 and subsequent generational shifts that the German medical community began to openly investigate and apologize for its role in the Third Reich. The realization that physicians had been the pioneers of the Holocaust, rather than reluctant participants, was a painful but necessary national reckoning. The legacy of the Nazi doctors casts a long shadow over modern anatomy and science. For years, medical students in Vienna and around the world studied from the Pernkopf topographic human anatomy, an atlas renowned for its incredible detail. It was later revealed that many of the illustrations were based on the bodies of executed political prisoners and victims of the Gestapo. This sparked a fierce ethical debate: should the book be banned? Or should it be used with a disclaimer to honor the victims whose bodies were exploited? Similarly, the Dachau hypothermia data remains a subject of controversy. While most scientists reject it as flawed and unethical, the question of whether knowledge obtained through torture can ever be redeemed remains an open wound in the scientific conscience. Today, the story of the Nazi doctors serves as a terrifying warning about the fragility of medical ethics. It demonstrates how easily the moral compass of a profession can be magnetized by political ideology and career ambition. These men were not monsters in the fairy tale sense. They were men of science who believed they were doing the right thing for their nation. They allowed the concept of the greater good to erase the humanity of the individual standing before them. They forgot that the physician's primary duty is to the patient, not the state, the race, or the history books. As we look back at the grey buses of Grafeneck, the ramps of Auschwitz, and the courtrooms of Nuremberg, we are left with a solemn obligation. The Nuremberg Code is not just a legal text. It is a firewall built against the darkness that resides in the human capacity for rationalization. We must remain vigilant, understanding that the tools of medicine, when stripped of compassion and unchecked by ethics, possess the terrifying power to destroy rather than to heal. The ghosts of the victims, the twins, the disabled, the rabbits, and the millions of unnamed stand as eternal witnesses, demanding that we never let the healer's hand become the executioner's blade again.